Welcome to the Literaturhaus, totally glocally artistic freedom in times of conflict. That's the title of tonight's event, organized by IFA and the Literaturhaus. We have invited 3 guests to have a conversation tonight. Julian Nida-Rümelin, former German Federal Government Commissioner for Culture and Media, author and visiting professor at many universities. Last year, he published his contribution, Cancel Culture, The End of Enlightenment, about the defense of humanism and enlightenment against intolerance, agitation, and the refusal to have a discourse. The practice of silencing unpopular opinions is very old and can already be observed in antiquity, says Nida-Rümelin. Sarah Wyatt headed the Freedom of Expression program at Penn International for many years, advised organizations such as UNESCO and the Council of Europe, and produced, among other things, a report on developments and restrictions on freedom of expression and creativity in Europe, as well as a report on the role of international institutions and funding agencies in protecting arts freedom. Lena Gorelik, a writer who has received many awards, curated the first Stuttgart Literature Festival last year under the title Writing While the World Happens, and to ask how we can resist the current temptations to think in terms of friends and enemies. She recently published the volume Trotzdem Sprechen, Speaking Nevertheless, an anthology of texts about the situation in Germany after October 7th. So what opinions, contradictions, and conflicts must a society endure? Where are the limits of freedom of expression and artistic freedom, not only with regard to authoritarian states, but also to liberal democracies? What efforts can we make for the benefit of ambiguity and dispute? The discussions about this topic are becoming increasingly emotional and polarized. The geopolitical challenges are also being felt in the cultural sector. The evening's guests will be introduced by Andreas Platthaus, head of literature at the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, author of numerous books and one of the leading experts on comics and illustration. In 2015, after Charlie Hebdo, he wrote, among other things, the introduction to the volume Zeichner verteidigen die Meinungsfreiheit, Illustrators Defend Freedom of Expression. The evening is a cooperation between IFA, Institute for Foreign Relations, and Literaturhaus Stuttgart in the event series Totally Glocally. In this series, the IFA asks questions about the interaction between the global and the local and draws attention to examples of cooperation. Thank you so much for the collaboration. All 3 guests have been asked to prepare a 5-minute impulse that will be in the introduction to the subsequent discussion. In an interview, Julian Nida-Rümelin said, "I enjoy discussing on panels with all kinds of people with different views, including those who have a diametrically opposed view to my own." We don't yet know how the room will be filled this evening, but I would like to thank everyone for accepting the invitation to join us this evening. I am very much looking forward to the discussions that lie ahead. Lena Gorelik's book, Trotzdem Sprechen, started with text messages. How are you? I'm thinking of you. And I'm convinced that differing political positions must not defeat the matter as a whole. This volume has been written with the desire for us to talk to one another again or learn once again to do so, the preamble reads. Thank you very much. Now I am pleased to ask Gitte, Zschoch, Secretary General of the IFA, to say a few words. When I took a look at the text written by my colleagues for tonight, I realized that you were referring to courage a lot. We need to be bold to have certain discussions. We need to endure certain discussions. We would like to thank the Literaturhaus for being so bold as to organize this event. We can learn from bold people at the IFA, and we can speak a lot about bold people. Long before the freedom of expression became a topic in Germany, we have seen them. We have seen governments and societies drawing limitations, artists being afraid of persuasion, because they critically question things with their art and they are no longer allowed to do so. We have seen that we need to protect these people. And this was the reason to create the Martin Roth Foundation, a program that protects artists who are no longer protected in their home countries. We offer protected visits for these artists, and the demand for this protection has increased drastically since we founded this organization. The right of artists to freely express themselves in times of geopolitical tension and the withdrawal of democratic values is more threatened than ever before. Arts freedom is the basis of creativity, and cultural production is the basis of democracy. It is protected by international, European, and national law. It is enshrined in the German Basic Law on an equal footing with the freedom of science and research and teaching. Following the definition of the UNESCO, artistic freedom is the freedom to imagine something, to create something, and to disseminate it. Artistic freedom must be free from state censorship, political intervention, or pressure from non-state actors. It encompasses the right of all citizens to access artistic values, and it is essential to the well-being of a society. We at the IFA see it as one of our central tasks to protect artistic freedom, especially when it is threatened, and to allow for debate. These debates are very emotional and polarized. And what we meet ever more often abroad is a doubt that artistic freedom in Germany is still existing. We want to include artistic freedom in the discourse around human rights. So we launched a study with Ole Reithoff and Sarah Wyatt, who published it. It's available in the back on the table. And this has been one of the reasons why we cooperated with the Literaturhaus to have this series, Totally Glocally, where we're looking at the interdependency of the global and the local. This allows us to have a look from the outside on our inner German debate. And the exchange of our Stuttgart audience is also important to us. We are a cultural mediator, and we are a local cultural institution, which is why we want to combine international points of view with local points of view. And we question ourselves, what do cultural institutions have to do to make space for this bold discourse? How can we allow for this in the public? What do we have to endure? How can we have this bold and courageous discourse and still protect people from discriminations? Where are the limits to this? And do we really promote artistic freedom? These are questions that we have to look at in our everyday work. And if you allow me one comment of event that takes place tomorrow, Eva Luz and Michael Brenner, on the topic of Israel tomorrow. You can register for this event online on ifa.de. Finally, I would like to seize this opportunity to thank the Literaturhaus, Stefanie Stegmann, for the great cooperation and the courage to have this discourse. I would like to thank the colleagues from IFA, from the Dialogue and Research team, Christina Burgrede, Clementine Wafui, for their excellent organization of this event. And with that, I wish you all the courage necessary to have this discussion and a lot of empathy. This is what I wish you all for tonight's discussion.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Zschoch, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you. Welcome to the panel discussion. You heard about what is planned. However, I'd like to start off with two housekeeping remarks. Now, most of the language you're going to hear here is German, but Sarah White will talk in English. So she will get an interpretation of the German spoken speeches and so on. And if you don't want to work so hard trying to understand the English, if you think it's a bit late at night and you feel a bit tired, if you want to make life easier for yourselves, there are headsets for you provided at the back so that you can follow the English in German.
All this German stuff which will be talked about.
Darüber hinaus wird der Abend mitgeschnitten.
Moreover, this event is going to be recorded and it's going to be published on the YouTube channel of IFA. Now, I suspect that not everyone has been asked whether they would agree and give their consent to this. That is why I'm going to ask you now. Now, should there be somebody in the audience who do not want to see their face or their person, even from the rear, to be recorded, now's the time to leave, and perhaps you'll even get your money back because you should have been told beforehand, of course. But I don't really believe that it takes such a lot of courage to really have the discussion we're going to have now. Of course, mind you, it's up to you too. We don't feel too courageous yet or too brave because you seem to be extremely peaceful here in the audience. Nevertheless, if after the input statements you wish to join in our discussion, we will give you a sign early. If we don't really want to limit public discussion until the very end of this event, don't feel obliged, however, to join in. But of course, it might be fascinating to talk to interesting panelists today. So use this opportunity. And because this is going to be recorded, microphones are going to be handed round the room. So before you start talking, wait until you've got the microphone. Otherwise, you will have undermined, of course, the whole idea of recording this event. Now, the subject today is associated with artistic freedom in times of conflict. Now, I do wonder why people, and in German there's a difference. It says the freedom of art compared to artistic freedom. So Kunstfreiheit, the freedom of the arts, there's a legal definition for this. It does not mention artistic freedom, however. So I found it interesting that you've opted for this term, artistic freedom. I don't think you did this deliberately. It was a deliberate choice. But it shows us that we are confronted with terminology that can be pretty complicated depending on what our notion of freedom is. But I believe we're going to hear interesting inputs from all three guests who are here today. So the way we're going to do it is like this. We're going to hear three input statements. Nida-Rümelin is going to start, Sarah White is going to continue, and Lena Gorelik is going to finish off this part. And then we're going to briefly have a discussion about these three input statements and check out how compatible we are and whether perhaps there's a need to discuss things first on the panel itself. And then you will have an opportunity to chime in. As I said, you don't need to. We have sufficient, of course, things to talk about up here, but you can do. And we would be pleased if you got so very much engaged here. And as you heard, the quote by Nida-Rümelin, it's interesting, of course, to discuss things with people who are of a different opinion. So make sure you speak freely, openly. And now I'm really looking forward to the input statements of my guests on the panel.
I accept the challenge. IFA and Literaturhaus invited a philosopher and cultural politician, but that is 22 years ago, and I was only a politician for 5 years, and I am not involved in the current discussions. I am just an observer like you. I read the papers and I think about these discussions. So I thought it might be a good idea to focus on the philosophical part of this debate. So my first comment. So far, everything's fine. I won't give you any reasons. We are living in times that are characterized by liberalism and a legal order that is characterized by liberalism. The liberal parties tend to be very small, and that proves this, because people think that they do not have to vote for these parties any longer because it's a given. At the same time, there has been one dispute right from the beginning. John Stuart Mill, one of the great minds of liberalism, but also of British utilitarianism, was convinced that freedom is justified because it contributes to the general well-being. We provide freedom, and then we can expect a society to develop positively. He was an optimist, a reformist, one of the few feminists among the classicists of philosophy. Plato maybe was the first. And that's wrong. One of the smartest minds was wrong. And this is proven since 1970. Amartya Sen, an Indian brilliant economist and mathematician. He held 2 professorships at the Harvard University for philosophy and economy, and he proved that this is not true. The right to freedom and the recognition of certain areas of decision-making, namely what a person studies, whom they marry, what association they join, etc., might get in conflict with the idea of optimizing preferences. And even if we are all agreed, it might at the same time be in conflict with individual rights. That's a liberal paradox. You can Google it if you want further details. And this makes it very clear what the message that I have for you today. There are many reasons, political reasons for arts freedom or artistic freedom, for arguments. It is better to know about different positions. That brings us forward. Arts has more facets. It considers different ideologies and political backgrounds and so forth. But art freedom and political freedom cannot justify this. We must commit to the intrinsic value of freedom. It cannot be justified instrumentally, as many people still think. And now it's getting interesting. Now, many people like to say, why should I give space to someone whose opinion I do not share or even consider dangerous if I have the task, if I have the option to prevent this someone from taking part in a panel? It might be on social media, an exhibition. If I have the opportunity to prevent this by organizing protests, for example, in advance, and make the organizers withdraw the invitation or not even making an invitation, why shouldn't I do that? I am glad if such an opinion is not voiced. That is exactly the risk of instrumentalizing individual rights. In the long run, leads to the destruction of these rights. And we are currently in a process that is multifaceted in different countries with different parties and different motives that questions this intrinsic value of arts freedom. This is a cultural change that is also taking place here. There has been a survey among scientists who considers this freedom at risk. And many said, well, it's not that bad, but it is a fact that something has changed. And this also applies to artistic practice in Germany. And finally, as I'm only allowed to speak 5 minutes, there are at least 2 dimensions of freedom that we must differentiate. There is this smart study by Christoph Müller that Claudia Roth commissioned. It's really worth reading. I agree with most of it. He's a very smart legal person, but the core is about ethos and culture. Without violating juridic norms, you can destroy artistic freedom in Germany. We can discuss that later. If there is no stance of ethos, we have the tools to obstruct these freedoms and to destroy the existence of these freedoms, which is why I would like to refer to two aspects. One is the freedom of the individual, and the other is the freedom of the institution in which arts take place, just like science. And that is a very delicate matter. I, for one, am of the opinion, now I'm speaking as the cultural politician, the practice of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, and also France and other countries like Great Britain. There is a state funding of theaters. And that is not a threat to the arts' freedom, but a condition for their freedom, because then it can implement many things that it wants to implement, which wouldn't otherwise be possible because it is not dependent on the market. So this institutionalization is a form of freedom. Of course, it is not if the city councillor decides on the program. There is one specific case, for example, like that in Germany, which I find very problematic indeed. So institutional freedom is also a result of non-interference, if those who could interfere do not interfere. And accordingly reduce themselves to a minimal form of cultural responsibility. If the institutions are free to shape the arts according to their opinion, but the artists still can pursue their artistic purpose, but the requirements are set by the curators or others. In that case, the institutional form of artistic freedom would still be under threat. So there are two dimensions to that, and I think we should consider both. Thank you so much. It's your turn, Sarah.
Well, as introduced, I'm a long-standing expert on what we call freedom of artistic expression rather than freedom of the arts, making it specific to like media freedom and otherwise, yeah. And I've been monitoring the state of artistic freedom around the world, most recently working for the Oslo-based Arts Freedom Monitor FreeMuse, where we publicise abuses across the world, attacks on artists, imprisonment, censorship, and even, sadly, murders. Where these attacks occur will be of little surprise to you because they follow the human rights in many of the worst abusers, countries like Iran, China, Cuba, and closer to home, Turkey. But my particular interest and recent studies have focused on arts freedom in Europe. I've been working with the Council of Europe, and I've written 2 reports, one published last year and one soon to be published. These reports identified developments across Europe, including the existence of laws that are designed specifically or are misused to suppress freedom of expression and creativities. And these tend to be around issues such as anti-terrorism, religious insult, obscenity, insult to the states. But in these reports, I don't just focus on the bad guys, I won't name them, But I was given the opportunity to explore what it is that hinders creativity of artists in all European countries, democratic and less so. And for my studies, I had the opportunity to meet in person with artists from across Europe, and from Norway, Belgium, Hungary, Turkey, everybody. Some did speak of the impact of laws that overtly suppress free speech and are manipulated in a way to suppress it, like anti-terror laws. I'm quite keen on anti-terror laws, but when they're being used to applied against legitimate expressions, for example, the struggle for minority rights, it becomes questionable. You've got insult to religion laws, which are used to shut down criticism of religions and religious leaders. We have obscenity laws, which are used against LGBT and against women, maybe talking about abortion and sexual abuse. Insult laws that shut down criticism of leaders, state institutions, and even flags, and turning a satirist into a traitor. And so terms that we think we understand are constantly being twisted and reinterpreted in unrecognizable ways by governments and by others. But what is striking is the extent of self-censorship across Europe. Self-censorship is difficult to measure, but you certainly feel it. It's what I define in my reports as under-the-radar censorship. We know pretty much how many artists are in prison or have been attacked, how many pieces of work have been pulled off walls. But what we don't know so much is the self-censorship. So overshadowing that is, overshadowing us all, is a populist media that vilifies artist work, it influences public perception, threatens, creates fake news, around the typical issues around gender, LGBT, minorities and immigration. And you're right, they go both ways. It's not just government, it's also others. This negative publicity from wherever it's coming from can stop artists from not just producing work, but being given a performance space. A theatre may not want to have you on their theatre. And their work is withdrawn, threats of violence. And this is not exclusively so, but particularly so in a sector where making a living is precarious at the best of times. So it might seem wiser to stay away from certain topics that might bring you trouble from wherever it comes from, however deeply you may care about it. Then you've got governments, as mentioned, attempting to influence or take control of cultural sectors, cultural institutions across Europe. Again, works being excluded, exhibitions shut down and funding removed. And this is also the case for private funders, are also influenced by these factors. And these are one of the issues that's explored in the IFRA report, which was referred to there. And we also talk about the local funding and the need for arm's length and how arm's length can you really be. Those kinds of questions will be in that report. Now, I'm sorry about this, but until recently, Germany has stood out as one of the good guys, at least when it comes to freedom of expression. But I imagine some of you here will have noticed that some of the issues I've mentioned above, which have happened elsewhere, are happening here now. Okay, we've been, you will know this, but since October the 7th, there has been an alarming rise in anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim sentiments. And for an artist, German or otherwise, to criticize Israel, to denounce the killings of the 44,000 in Gaza to date, to call for a ceasefire, and to denounce what is happening as an atrocity or a crime against humanity, it to be labelled as anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. I don't want to go into the details of this, but the fact that we just cannot even talk about it without fearing some kind of repercussion. At Free News, we've been watching with workers have had their works removed from exhibitions. You'll know probably more than I do, the withdrawal of awards, blacklisting, exclusion. I've heard a figure of around 180 artists who have been penalised specifically in this way. But I think the number of those who are censoring themselves must be much larger. And again, it'll be immeasurable. We've also seen artists who now, I know of artists who are now saying, I'm not going to come to Germany, I'm not going to exhibit. And of course, we've had For instance, the petition with thousands of artists calling for a cultural boycott. The Bundestag resolution calling for an ending of funding for anti-Semitic organizations, supporters of boycotts, as a means to end anti-Semitism is unlikely to succeed. And it also adds to the fears that of this is undermining the Constitution itself in the Basic Law, Article 5, which protects freedom of expression and specifically said there shall be no censorship. Yeah. So for decades, I've been focusing on Turkey, which is my country of expertise, and I've criticized the misuse of anti-terror laws to shut down legitimate criticism of army abuses against the Kurds, for instance. I'm watching with deepening alarm as foreign agent laws are used to penalize artists and others as traitors, notably anti-war artists in Russia. So it's distressing to see Germany, an otherwise democratic country, join the ranks of censors of legitimate comment. For now, not imprisoning artists, but through blacklisting and exclusion. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, I do hope that I'm not repeating anything that's been said before. I do believe, however, that my viewpoint is a bit different. It's that, well, at least, from an artistic perspective, I begin with thinking, this is where artistic freedom begins. It begins now. Before the first sentence is spoken, even already when the thought is formed in the mind, when the first word is spoken, knowing that it is me who decides that I'm going to write this text, how am I going to begin it, and which punctuation mark I'm going to put. The freedom to think, the freedom to speak, to write, even in public and publicly. This is the artistic freedom that allows me to write, but I fear for it now. And this fear is not just a word, it has come to roost, and it grows fatter with the day-to-day news and events. Looking at electoral polls and knowing that one of these parties has been classified by the Office for the Protection of the Constitution as definitely right extremist, and that it could find itself sitting in the Bundestag as the second biggest political force in less than 90 days, for example. At the same time, the Berlin Senate is axing the budget for culture by 12%, and similar cuts to culture are looming in other cities too. When a resolution has been adopted that was arguably worded to combat anti-Semitism, but in actual fact is setting anti-Semitism against racism and makes ideological screening a practical choice. When curators from art and literature institutions or theatres say that they have to exert caution in how they think and make their plans, as they do not want to give rise to controversy, when artists are threatened and more security personnel and the police are required to protect cultural events, when art criticism is calling out their name in public, which is why more and more artists prefer to stay mute. When debates on all these subjects get so much out of hand that there is no dialogue to speak of anymore, because people get disinvited, their appearance cancelled, or they get shouted down, this in spite of the fact that this is what art in actual fact excels at, asking questions. It is for a reason that authoritarian states and systems, as they establish themselves, invariably curb artistic freedom first of all. Even if we would love to think about them simply as heartless louts, they know the power of art very well indeed. That art can raise questions, that it can shake at the root of what they want people to believe in, that art creates images, dreams, that it remembers, gives warnings, contradicts, and emphasizes that it can shift the limelight, that it practices critique, and that it has the effect of making us stop and think. That is why dictatorships relegate artists into stooges. That is why they are hunted, thrown into prison, killed. It is a long road before things get this far. Most often it is taken gradually. It is sneaking up upon us. by choosing certain people for artistic leading positions, by distributing public funds only to certain institutions or artists, by curtailing financial support, changing funding policies, or by indirect censorship. You can actually watch freedom as it disappears, slowly but surely, in authoritarian regimes. We, cultural workers and society, support this process if we adopt the self-same mechanisms that seek to impose a revisionist mindset on us, makes us see everything as either good or evil. In times when political and cultural discourse is limited to dichotomies, an either-or approach, are you for deportations or against, for Israel or for Palestine, for climate protection or against it? We are led too quickly to believe that we can see clearly beyond any shadow of a doubt who our enemy is. Sadly, this is also true for discussions and the topics discussed within the world of arts itself. There is less and less room for deviations from the norm, but also for differentiated deliberation, slow-moving analyses, or unanswered questions, for yes, but on the other hand also, and no, although, sooner or later it will disappear from sight. When people no longer talk to each other because a dialogue is rejected, when the wrong ones are sitting on the power, because people prefer shouting to just talking, because they are blamed blanket fashion for not questioning accusations made, or whether these are based on facts, when art is no longer the place where you can watch, criticize, endure tension, where different viewpoints and perspectives come together, where there is space for nuances, then we will face each other like enemies, like parties engaged in warfare, which will only help those who want to restrict the freedom of thought, of speech. Artistic freedom means being free to decide. Nobody knows this better than us, who are trying to create this art. We here will decide on the sound as well as the nuances, on form, on content, on colors of words, on tempo and volume, on where to put the punctuation. We use such punctuation marks in order to tell a story, to ask questions, or to show something, to understand, to question, or to give testimony. Through the subjects we choose, the content we provide, with our art we are probing gaps, stumbling blocks, the pain points of our time, of our communities. We are free to respond to what we observe happening around us in the world. And we can also choose to ignore it. In this case, we're using our freedom to decide against responding. Every day we decide afresh how we're going to make use of the privilege of our freedom that has become so endangered recently. Whether in public debates or in the artistic stances we take up, we decide how we want to deal with societal developments, whether we accept its mechanisms, whether we think we had better talk to somebody or refuse to talk with them, whether cancelling might perhaps be an option, whether we come up with assertions or ask questions, whether we listen and to whom, or whether we just ride it out. Ride out the storm. At the moment, we are still free to make this decision. Do we want to defend artistic freedom or not? This is where artistic freedom begins. Now, with a conversation like the one we're going to have now. Thank you.
Of course, it's not an ideal prerequisite for a discussion that we mostly agree on most of the topics. Well, the basic concern that I've heard in all three contributions is the loss of freedom, the loss of freedoms. Nida-Rümelin very clearly talked about the philosophical perspective, the loss in attitude, because culture is what brings the society together. So you don't need legislation to get this process started. It's all about the attitude, as he said, the stance that we seem to lack these days. This is at least what I hear in all three contributions. Now, we are talking about the German situation, and it was fascinating to hear Sarah speak about Turkey and other states. She's an expert in Turkey, and she sees similar developments in Germany. Lena Gorelik grew up in a Russian family and arrived in Germany as a child, so she knows how a suppressive society feels like. And Julian Nida-Rümelin talked about and worked with state philosophies so much, so that I would like to get back to that. What do you think? What's the current situation in Germany, also compared to other countries? Sarah Wyatt said, we are already on the slippery slope. Do you see it that way? And if so, what can we do to act against this? So when it comes to international comparison, I think you should comment on this. For personal reasons, for biographical reasons, I am linked to 2 countries in Europe. My wife is French, and the overwhelming part of my wife's family comes from Israel and Italy, and also the USA, because I was a visiting professor in the US. And maybe that was a misinterpretation or a misjudgment, but I think compared to the USA, Germany was in a good position. I know we are not discussing scientific freedom, but it is similar to the freedom of artistic expression. You very beautifully summarized this. The attitude, the stance. Now I would like to mention a crazy example. I was quite familiar with Jörg Immendorf. He was also very active during that time and died at a very early age. If you know his work, you'll know that he was a board member of the KPW and was invited to China often, and he was very proud of that. So he thought the Cultural Revolution in China was great, with more than 20 million deaths. And then he had a phase where his art got worse, when he tried to include these contents. I don't know for sure, I haven't done the research, but nobody ever would have guessed to not have an exhibition with Immendorf because of that. And that is nothing harmless. The Maoist policy was inhuman. And nobody even suggested to cancel his exhibitions. So I was really surprised that when the Russian attack on Ukraine happened, Georgiev was under attack. Georgiev was under attack because he did not distantiate himself from Russian politics. I don't know, you might know better. Does he put human lives at risk if he took a stance here? So he is a very impressive maestro and not a politician. And so how does it occur to us to get rid of him as an intendant, as an artistic director? In Milano, the Dostoevsky lecture was stopped when the war started. Are we crazy? What has Dostoevsky to do with it? So something is changing, and this leads to fear. Fraser, for example. This is not part of artistic freedom, but still it's an interesting example. Nancy Fraser was invited to come to Cologne, and then they canceled the invitation because she was talking in a pro-Palestinian way. One of the most important philosophers of the USA is uninvited because they find that she's not allowed to give this lecture that might deal with opinions that the University of Cologne doesn't share. That's a new McCarthyism. That's the result. And one last sentence, maybe. I wrote this book that was quoted earlier. The cancel culture is not good because it comes from the right direction. It is practiced by all the different fields. It's not based on political opinions. It's about the attitude. Deplatforming is what it's about. How can I avoid certain opinions to be voiced on certain platforms? You quoted me earlier, and then you left out one half sentence. I said, I want to discuss with everyone on all panels, but there are limits. I like to talk to neo-Nazis, but I don't want the public to be listening. So that is a limit. Ms. Gorelik, would you like to comment on Russia? No, I would like to talk about Germany, actually. You've been asking for constructive behaviors. You were asking about our concerns. I think being constructive is based on taking a close look at what is actually happening and at occasions when certain freedoms are curbed. Like, for example, Dostoevsky, the example you mentioned. And taking a look, you mentioned McCarthy, for example, is being used a lot. I do not want to negate this, but again, I think it is part of an analysis of reduced emotions. I think both of you mentioned this polarized debate. Emotions are part of this, and we really need to take a close look at what's happening and what is not happening. People are uninvited or invitations are cancelled, that's a fact. But I published the volume Trotzdem sprechen, Speaking Nonetheless. And I've been taking part in panels on Israel and Palestine for a year now. And on all the panels, this has been repeated over and over again. The number of dead civilians, the call for ceasefire. And I'm still sitting on a panel and making the flat assumption that saying this is impossible in Germany is not helpful. I think we really need to take a closer look at this, because McCarthy's emotional shout that in Germany we are no longer able to speak out is wrong. If the right-wing parties follow a certain policy, like, for example, reduced funding, so this statement that you are no longer allowed to speak out really is of benefit to those who would like to curb these freedoms. You wanted to have a controversial debate, so I think this tactical handling of phenomena like these is wrong. I think it is true that right-wing politicians like to say that you are no longer allowed to say, and the answer is this is your doing because the AfD oppresses opinions and arts and theater plays. In the US, DeSantis called Florida the Vogue-free zone. That is censorship. That is cancelled culture. So parents become agitated. They make sure that no transgender persons and gay authors visit the schools to give lectures. That is cancel culture. And it doesn't matter to me for what reasons they do that. And if the right-wing politicians say you are no longer allowed to say what you think, it's directed against the left-wing politicians. That is a general pattern of political history. What started in the left wing for humanistic reasons is then accepted by the right-wing politicians and taken to the extreme. So you need to criticize the core of it. Many of those who, up until recently, said we are right to suppress opinions that are no longer up to date, they are affected now. The BDS petition and so forth. So these people are now experiencing the danger of this. So this type of oppression of opinions, of people having certain opinions, unpopular opinions, and in the worst case scenario, might even destroy lives, is independent from the motives. And it's completely unacceptable.
Yes. Going back to my comment on Turkey, yes, of course, it's not quite as difficult here as it. Oh, so be closer, yeah. That better? Yeah. I was saying that the comparison with Turkey isn't so much to do with the numbers, but the ways that issues and words are twisted and used to suppress certain groups of people. And this is something that you see right across Europe. You see it in Hungary. You see rewriting history. You see it right across. And of course, yes, we've also seen it in the UK to a certain extent, and in the US. It's not for as I see it, it's not for politicians to tell us what we should and shouldn't say. There are concerns, of course. I'm not a complete free speech fundamentalist. There are certain things that I believe should not be said. I'm not sure where I draw the line, but it's really for the courts to decide. You have hate speech laws. You have definitions of hate speech. Cases need to be discussed there. But even in the courts, there's a difference of opinions. You might get the same case heard by different judges who will come to a different conclusion. I mean, I understand there's been a number of cases in Germany of the BDS-linked organizations having their venues not being allowed to be at certain venues, and they've gone to courts, and the same courts have ruled in favor, and another one has ruled against. It's really, really a very, very tricky sort of situation. And as we've been saying, for me, it's about always discussing, always debating. The problem comes in the ways that speech in general is being instrumentalized by not just politicians, but by other groups, and then powered by social media. And then we go into a whole other discussion about the mediation of social media and its role it's having in this current crisis.
Nun haben wir ja auch von Nida-Rümelin gehört, die Cancel Culture an sich ist.
Now, we heard from Nida-Rümelin that cancel culture is not a new phenomenon. It's a new term, but it's been an anthropological constant Now, Sarah just said that social media, of course, was a factor that accelerates a lot of these things. It provides for new opportunities of excluding people. But it's interesting that you compare this against the term McCarthyism. So that was a time when there was no social media society as we know it today. So this technological development, does that play a role? Because all of this can be orchestrated more easily. You can trigger cancel culture even easier from a much more powerful basis, as it were. So does that play a role? And if it does, what would that mean for our future? Perhaps that means that we will have to control social media in a different way from today. Now, I talked about us, or we, because we, the authors who wrote this piece, and we stitched together hundreds of examples from different examples, China, Egypt, and so on. And in actual fact, I would say cancel culture avant la lettre has existed everywhere and always. It's a normal strategy. So that those who compete for public influence can do their competition using these means. Now, this went brilliant, of course, in the different empires, with defamation campaigns. It was even the emperor's spouses who were highly cynical and who indulged in that. And the fact that we have so little literature surviving from antique times, I mean, if you look at Greek literature, it shows that they had brutal cancel culture, well, amongst the Christianized forces, for example, in Rome. Now, I don't really want to enlarge on this. Nevertheless, it's been a constant, really. Now, but democracy is something special. It is something strange because democracy expects from us that we can form our own judgment, that we willingly engage in discussion and conversation. And this can only work if this is supported by a culture of respect, of mutual recognition, of equality, freedom, and if certain rights become part of our daily practice. I'm not starting to shout at somebody just because they have a different opinion, really. If I do respond, I will do this in a way that allows us to continue a conversation normally. Now, I can be quite unrelenting. I say that cancel culture has always existed, so what we're seeing now is nothing new. But democracy is something special, and it is democracy that comes under the wheels if we go too far. I would even say that Germany, by international comparison, is still doing well. The situation is still good, but something is beginning to slip. And I think that is something that we should be highly concerned about. Well, I believe this, and in order to return to the second part of your question about the social media and that these tend to accelerate everything, that the social media are a place where, firstly, polarization happens, a place where artists take up a stance quickly, and because of the format, in an abridged manner, very often, of course, it's up to each and everyone on whether they want to participate and use it. But obviously, there seems to be a movement or a tendency for more and more people to get engaged, and then cancelling. Not by institutions, but amongst artistic circles. So you exhibit the work of others, so you're saying this and that person wrote this and that. This makes quite clear, I mean, if you do use social media, you will know pretty accurately who belongs into which camp. And then, of course, you could use social media as a source, of course, in order to check up on people. That is, the institutions can use social media to check up on people. Who said what, when. And that is why, because of the social media, it has become possible for these things to happen quicker, but also to gain faster access to what is happening. Now, of course, my background is traditional literature, so if you only looked at texts that an author has written when they had the time and didn't need to, shorten their story in any way. So I know I've got a bit polemic here, but that is what is happening.
I'd like to just contradict myself here and also say that social media is a great power for good as well, in that we can use social media to counter those arguments. We've all seen wonderful, usually creative, usually artistic pieces which have who have challenged, who have made fun of, who have subverted messages from these groups as well. So just to remember that it's also a positive thing. We're constantly talking about it as negative, or certainly in my field. I've noticed that globally, the people who are most likely to be attacked, imprisoned, are young people, are rappers. Many rappers in countries like in across Africa, in the Americas, in the UK and elsewhere, because they go on social media, they have their specific message, they can feel dangerous and they're very challenging, and they're talking from societies that actually don't normally reach out to people like us, shall we say. And they also do find themselves at the sharp end. Satirists, people who do little sketches, are also very popular, and they're also getting kickback, but they keep doing it, and they keep doing it, because access to social media is easy, it's cheap. You can do it in your bedroom or wherever. So I just want to put a little bit of, although I've also said that these rappers are also getting attacked, I just want to put a little bit of positivity into this. Would you agree with me, Lena, that as much of positive as negative?
Ja, definitiv. Ich glaube nur.
Yes, definitely. However, I do believe that, especially when they talk about arts freedom and the processes that you can see happening in Germany at the moment, social media are used especially for this kind of restricting freedom. So when people get uninvited, I believe the first response is to write an open letter. And another factor would be who posted what, when, where. And that is what I believe. The social media are getting instrumentalized a lot. Now, I would like to really reach out to our audience here, whether somebody feels the need to ask a question or perhaps to add to what has been said here. We do have a question. Please wait until you've got the mic. Oh, it's right where you are. That's handy. So I'll try to speak in such a way that you can hear me. For over 20 years, I worked for a newspaper. Since 20 years, I've now been a freelancer. And because I was the boss, I was also in charge of answering readers' letters. And they were only published if the place where the person lived and their name was contained in the letter. Now, unless there was some special need for protection. And in Germany, there is a politician called Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, and she tried to insist that when people voice themselves on social media, that they would not stay anonymous, but that their name would be mentioned. Now, people heaped ridicule on her, and they said that this ran in the face of her freedom of expression. But I have to say, from today's vantage point, it's a shame that every, idiot, can write whatever on the social media, and that is a big problem, really. Perhaps you can see a way, as colleagues, as it were. Well, I think politically, there's not much we can do, and social media now is big business, of course. So thank you very much for giving me the floor and the opportunity to say this. And there's another question from in the back row, I believe, at the very end of the hall. Thank you. I wanted to chime in because the number of 180 cancellations, can you put it that way? I'm not sure. And this number stems from a list penned by an activist association. Can I call it an association? So a list compiled by this group. And I only noticed now when I thought about what's happened last weekend, these events that have taken place. So I don't really want to leave this number uncommented because I think, you have to take a second look at it. Because some included in that number are not cancel cases. So I think you really have to tread very carefully. So what facts you're using in your debate. Any other comments? And here's one in the first row. I too wanted to say something about the social media because earlier we talked about self-censorship, and I believe for creative artists, social media, even though you said that very often, you will find yourself in a niche with your opinion, or people call you out, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Booktop Germany. I'm sure that most of you will know it, whether that's a curse or a blessing for the book trade, who knows. But there are a lot of these different movements, trends, and people call out for boycotts, for example. And also independent creatives, get really talked down and vilified. And that is why it's important to have a lot of independent creatives. So the danger of self-censorship is real because artists are so grateful for the visibility they've gained that way, and they don't want to endanger this. So I'm not quite sure what the opinion is of the panel with regards to what I said on the social media. Now, perhaps before we will move on to you, but because there is a specific question, perhaps you can respond to it immediately. Perhaps, Mr. Nida-Rümelin, you will go first. Well, I would like to give an answer to both questions, actually. Well, up until April this year, I was the vice president of the German Ethical Council, and we wrote an opinion too on humans and machine. It was too long, 400 pages. And we really took a lot of effort in answering these questions or taking up a stance. So, social media, what has gone wrong in this regard? And actually, even if you go back in history, I believe it was President Clinton's decision at the time to make sure there would be some journalistic or editorial responsibility that you should have. So the fact that it's possible to now use it anonymously was also part of the original plan. Now, and because Europe always lags behind these technologies and jumps on the bandwagon, I mean, if you look at ChatGPT, we did not contribute to it, we simply apply it. Because of this, we will also take on board the way they're constituted. If you look at the data privacy regulation, it tries to counteract this, but it didn't really work if you look closely, at least not as far as the big companies, the big tech firms in the US are concerned. And that is why we really discussed this at length. Unfortunately, it's now contained in the text, but it's slightly vague because it was discussed quite controversially. Now, Europe, which always insists on following its own path, AI, transparent UI, it should be human-centered and all these things. So isn't one of the key aspects here that we should come up with an offer for an alternative infrastructure of digital interaction? But a lot of people keep saying, but you don't stand a chance against the big ones. But it's not that simple because you could change certain levers. You could, for example, ask for a fee for the usage of data. If you did, then things would change very differently, would change very quickly in Europe. So whether this is organized by using foundations or other platforms, and there are experts we have in the European Union, and I believe we have to go down this road. if we are only ever the appendix to these dynamic developments taking place in the US, if we just play along, then we will also lose some of our political culture. And I believe that Europe should be much more brave. In China, you have a state-controlled citizen score model, for example. And so we have the US model, everything free, unrestricted, commercial, no antitrust restriction. All of this is no longer applies because they've all gotten far too powerful. If you look at the large petroleum companies, they're far too big. They've never actually been, broken down. And now it's too late. So I believe Europe really should find its own strategy for a digital infrastructure.
Jemand von Ihnen beiden?
Would you like to answer one of the questions?
The question about numbers, and you're absolutely right that the numbers that are given can be manipulated up or down depending on where your stance is, and also how you define a cancellation, how you define an attack or whatever. It really underlines to me what we wrote in the IFA report, that there is, even in Europe, a lack of independent monitoring that can counter that. I know the figure is pretty large because we've been collecting it independently ourselves, but you're quite right to question that figure. What we really need is proper, independent monitors with expertise, with human rights, data collection expertise. Then we don't fall into that trap. Maybe I did or didn't, I don't know. But I do appreciate the question. That was a good point.
Dann übernehme ich mal die letzte Frage.
Okay, then I would like to answer the last question that is in line with Sarah's answer. I cannot guess the amount of self-censorship that exists, but I think it has a lot to do with what you think you can see in social media. And I think this also applies to all other political discourses. Is the algorithm capable of presenting us a certain world in which you are not allowed to say certain things? I think the other side, be it the left, right, pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, would say exactly the same thing and would see only confirmation in social media. So every attempt to review this scientifically or to find the facts of what is actually going on and what is only repeated needs to be opposed to facts. And that is more important than ever because social media reinforce this tendency. And this might create pressure to voice your opinion. You of course, you can also decide not to voice your opinion. And there are also algorithm-based bubbles where it is totally okay not to voice an opinion in social media. But I think we need to work on that with facts. Before I give the floor to you in the back, I wanted to get back to you because you talked to me directly. That was an interesting example. It was best practice in journalism that letters by readers in newspapers are only published if you know the identity, if you know the person by name and the address. And I think most newspapers still follow that practice. And I think in social media, and if social media users send us their comments, they are asked to disclose their identity with a newspaper. But on the internet, this is not the case. If you find these comments in the newspaper, if you look at the comments on the internet of a newspaper, you can post whatever you want because it is no longer possible to trace back the identity of all the different comments, and also because people say this is my alias, and that is generally accepted. So I think it is a pity that we haven't made the effort in the beginning to work on that we just accepted this new momentum, and now getting back to what we had is really difficult. And that is one of the basic problems when dealing with phenomena like this one that we haven't been familiar with. We are a little bit too late in this process. And I'm experiencing two different worlds when it comes to reader comments. But now let's have the question in the back. Good evening. I would like to share one thought, and I also have one specific question. Your example, Professor Nida-Rümelin, the example of Dostoevsky. I don't think that you should cancel a lecture, but there is a reason why that happened. And also, when it comes to Ukrainians, they don't want this. And I think that in addition to the interest and the empathy, we should explain more. Also, when we have an event like this one tonight, we should explain the perspective of the other. What's the problem about Dostoevsky? Of course, many people know Dostoevsky, but you might misuse his work, and getting to know and understanding the other's perspective requires more explanations. And you could consider that in an event like this one. And then my question. We have heard a lot about the limitations and the negative developments. In your opinion, are there also positive developments like new legislations or examples that show a different tendency?
There have been a number of countries that have changed or removed problematic laws. Since 2016, there's been 3 countries that have removed their blasphemy laws: Greece, Italy, and Malta. And Malta has recently also changed its laws to specifically protect satire, which is quite interesting. Ireland removed an obscenity law recently. There had been actually growing interest in freedom of artistic expression. 10 years ago, when I started on this, people were saying this is not really a thing. But now we're seeing many conferences and discussions about it, so that's a good thing as well. The problem with freedom of artistic expression or artistic freedom is more the lack of understanding of what we're talking about, even among artists themselves. The lack of knowledge of what you can do to protect artistic freedom, lack of knowledge of what is and isn't an attack on artistic freedom. And this is something that myself and my colleagues have been working on, what the IFA report is on. But overall, yes, there are slow, good changes. Legal changes take a long, long, long time. But they happen. They happen.
Also zwei.
I would also like to answer your question. First one, that was not an example from Ukraine, but from Milano. But of course, in Ukraine, we have a very, there is a very difficult situation also when it comes to culture. The Ukraine is not part of the European Union. In the European Union, it wouldn't be possible to oppress minorities and languages. But this is something else. This had nothing to do with Ukraine, but with Italy. And I found it quite remarkable. And I thought it gives great reason for concern to use that attack as a reason or an explanation to do that. And this conveys an ideology as well. And taking an author like this one out of a university's program is, to me, completely unacceptable. And my second comment about the positive tendencies, maybe I can refer to Germany. I am only an observer. I am no longer responsible or shaping this, but I found that the courts are acting quite reasonably. I'm now using the problematic term, checking ideology and linking this to funding. This is happening also in Berlin, and that's a good sign. And also in working on the Documenta scandal and the anti-Semitic pieces of art, at the end, the readers did not prevail. Claudia Roth shouldn't have allowed this piece of art that would have been dramatic if it is up to the policymakers to decide on this. Hopefully, Claudia Roth never chooses pieces of art to show on the Documenta. But that was, of course, a governance problem. That was a cascade of diffusing responsibilities. There were curators that were responsible. Their responsibility was delegated to art directors. So at the end of the day, there was not a single person who was in charge. And also the refusal to take a stance as an individual. That was very interesting. But I think the response that we've seen, that this is not possible, that the policymakers decide, that was positive. I would also like to say one sentence on Dostoevsky and another one on positive developments. I also try to make that point in my introduction. I think the arts have always been a place of negotiation or deliberation. So coming back to Dostoevsky, the dispute evolving around Dostoevsky should happen. What characterizes a language? What shapes the Russian language? In how far is the Russian language shaped by realism? What is Dostoevsky even writing about? Maybe so far we have only considered this on an aesthetic level, but we have never questioned certain images that he uses. This is exactly one purpose of the arts, and this is the place where we should discuss these questions. And prohibiting is the contrary of discussing and researching and exploring. So it contradicts the purpose of arts per se. And when it comes to positive developments, so we've heard international examples, we've heard about the legal perspective. Maybe I can speak about my own experience with cultural institutions after the 7th of October. I was looking into these cancellations a lot, and I tried again and again to have conversations and debates that some people say would not be possible, but I have had these debates. And I put a lot of effort into bringing these discussions on stage, and I experienced a lot of support by many cultural institutions, and I have received many invitations. So I would like to speak out against this. So there is the political side with certain requirements and intentions, but there are still individual cultural institutions that are really committed to everyone being able to say what they want, up to a certain limit, of course, which is negotiated individually, but that are committed to the freedom of speech and arts. There is one more comment, one more question. Could you please use the microphone? Let me come back to the beginning when we talked about the cancel culture. That was also the introduction of today. So it has been said that cancel culture always existed and that cancel culture has only become an existential problem through social media. And then you said, Mr. Nida-Rümelin, that the cancel culture has not suffered because of the media, but that cancel culture now meets democracy. But I think democracies have existed ever since the American Declaration of Independence. But before that, arts have already existed. Now the question is, does art depend on freedom to create, or can art not grow based on resistance?
Ist jetzt Kunst
Now, this hypothesis that art only thrives in free societies, I believe nobody posited that here tonight. But if you look at the arts of the medieval times and even Renaissance art, now that was an art of the clerics, of princes. He wanted to be remembered for eternity, for their glorious deeds. Now, this does not mean that therefore poor or bad art was produced, but it was clear that only those who were rich enough would enable arts, and they, of course, decided on, what would be created and what couldn't be made. So, great art. So, but I would say, of course, if you have a democratic framework that you don't instrumentalize arts. I mean, you can, of course, debate, of course. Democracy, what is democracy in a free, open and liberal society? But that is how I understand it, namely that we do not just see state art, but that the state opens up spaces for art to thrive. I don't want to, of course, say that these examples have not existed over time, but this is, of course, one, advantage of our society, and I don't think we should endanger it. We did have some impressive artistic developments in the past, classic modernism, for example. Now, this was viewed very critically at the very beginning, 1876, the Paris exhibition, the Impressionist painters. People said, now, this is awful art. It has nothing to do with how we understand art. And over the next decades, of course, this has engendered a wide variety of different arts, visual art. And so earlier it wouldn't have been possible for this kind of art to thrive, of course. It would have been stopped by the powers that be. Now, it really depends, of course, on your perspective. But if we say that the major developments over the history of art, so Greek art, Renaissance art, of course, that was something very new, which came up with a new idea of humans. These were always times when things changed spiritually. So the context for arts improved for the better because free thinking was more possible. It doesn't mean that societies were free. And that is why I tend to be more optimistic. Of course, we have fantastic art that was produced by slave societies such as Egypt, for example. But it's interesting to think about what the art would have looked like had these societies been freer. And that is a question that I get asked by people who were in the opposition in the GDR. They said, well, in the dictatorship times, we had a much more attentive audience. Hence, we were able to be a lot more subtle in the way we argued, and we could write much more intelligent texts. I mean, I'm putting it bluntly, of course. They put it much more intelligently than I can now. But something else is important is that we should look at what happens or what was created at the same time in more liberal societies. And is it true that the end result was poorer art? I would assert that, well, probably the field is a power, as I said. So we shouldn't just, focus on art. I mean, great art cannot justify the violation of human rights. Any other comments, questions? Yes, because you talked about art in medieval times. That is true. But I think something else that you should add is something that was mentioned before. That art freed itself from the powers that be happened earlier. I mean, Romanticism, for example, Sturm und Drang, this was no longer in the service, of course, of princes. I mean, Goethe, of course, did have a prince to serve, but he was much freer in the way he was able to exercise his art. So perhaps they preempted some developments already. That's where to happen later in democracies. Well, perhaps I can come in on this. Now, for me, this is like, Germany is a latecomer to democracy and even a failed democracy. If you look back to the 19th century with these incredible varied contributions to the development of art and science, it really paved the way for a freer society, obviously. So all of this did not just become possible because of democracy, but a diversity of science brought about a freer and more democratic society, or launched it, put it on the rails, as it were. Other questions or comments? Well, thank you, Herr Nida-Rümelin, for contributing your comments on visual arts. Now, what I'm lacking here is music. Music as an art. And music as an art form is slightly more, enjoys perhaps a little bit more independence compared to the word or visual arts. Now, that is something that I would like to add. Well, music doesn't rob people's back up so easily, perhaps. Now, before we are going to come to the grand finale, or before finishing off, let me come back to a question that has to do with art as such. Now, we just heard from an author, from Lena Gorelik, and also in the current booklet of the Academy of Arts in Berlin, it contains a comment by the new vice president about a program. And as we just heard, sometimes art is a little bit slower. It can take more time. It's not always as rushed as everyone else. Now, the arts is something that is to think in terms of boundaries. Artists, I would wager, are freer and they think more internationally in many different respects. Now, sometimes this seems to create some friction with the rise of nationalism again. So it's two ideals that come up against each other. And that is why I thought it was interesting to hear Sarah White mention the 7th of October 2023 as such an important hiatus for Germany too. And that is what I keep hearing from my friends abroad. How do you see it when they tell us, well, what is happening in Germany? You used to be so liberal, and now everything is much stricter. Now, of course, it's to do with the German history and the atrocities committed here. And because of this, people here proceed with a lot more caution compared to others, and hence follows very different rules. So to what extent do you believe that this is a fundamental conflict between the claim of art to work specifically for people and the states that look at the society, depending on the mentality, the social conditions, and everything else? If whom are you asking?
Well, I'm thinking that the censorship or the defunding is actually not just in Germany as well. There's been a big issue in the States and to a lesser extent in the UK. Interestingly, I'd not seen it so much in other countries, which I think I'm not really equipped to really understand why that is the case. It's clear why it is in Germany to a certain extent in the US. But it's all kinds of speech. It's not just the arts, really, in this particular case, to be honest. I think that artists have been very vocal in this case, which is unusual because usually artists don't work so much in collaboratively. Again, I'm not quite ready to understand why that is the case. Not a very good answer, but Best I can do.
Frau Gorelik, hätten Sie gegebenenfalls eine Erklärung dafür?
Mrs. Gorelik, perhaps you have an answer why, why the artists have become so vocal suddenly. Well, the way I feel is that this is something that already during the last years has been in the making. After the 7th of October, of course, it has become even more tangible. But that's to do with October and everything that followed in its wake, also the war against Gaza and the raison d'etat in Germany. But I believe all of this has meant that in Germany, the arts that I followed, the kinds of arts that I followed, have been a good deal more political and much more vocal over the last years already.
I began to see artists being much more upfront with the Arab Spring Revolution. When you saw musicians, you saw art, you saw it right up there. And that might also be partly due to the fact of social media.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, artists have always, played instruments and been marching at the front and done plays. But when was that? 2011. So I think actually that might be one of the reasons why we're seeing art more forefronted.
Wollen Sie noch? Ich muss nicht unbedingt bei Gorelik.
Perhaps you would like to, but I would like to hear you. Of course, I am happy to join in. Now, as I said before, I'm no longer doing cultural politics, but I still have my contacts, of course, with the Culture Foundation, the German Culture Foundation, and a lot of people who, play a role in the field of arts, such as the different curating councils or boards. So the people are worried that Germany perhaps detaches itself from the international scene, which very often has an attitude that takes up stances that are seen as problematic in Germany. So BDS, but there are a lot of critical artists, and not all of them are anti-Semitic. A lot of them are Jews who either supported BDS, which I think shouldn't be supported. I think the boycott idea is not the right one. But there are a lot of other endeavors, and a lot of people who could not possibly be suspected of anti-Semitism. So, and if we use this as a criterion for whether we are going to invite somebody to international exhibitions, literary events, then that wouldn't be good. So I believe we have to be very careful indeed. I'm very much in favor of showing solidarity, and the raison d'être, so the German raison d'être is something that is linked. I can understand this to some extent. So not just Joachim Gauck, but also Helmut Schmidt criticized it. So if understood and interpreted properly, so the chancellor didn't at the time, she was almost flippant about it. You can speak up for this, but this must not mean that vis-a-vis a government that includes right extreme people, that you should not distance yourself from it. And if you follow the terrible developments in the Gaza Strip, you cannot say you're going to ignore it, because this is only a state that defends itself in view of the terrible things happening there. That is not good enough. I mean, every person has the same worth. The political philosopher said that each human life has the same worth. So we have to be very careful that, something doesn't start to slip slide in Germany. Well, thank you very much for listening and for the interesting comments. And thank you ever so much to the three panelists we had here tonight, Lena, Gorelik, Sarah Bayat, and Julian, Nida-Rümelin.